So you've decided to write a fantasy novel. Good for you. Fantasy is a rich and exciting genre that offers many opportunities for compelling storytelling for adventurous writers. But where do you start? I'm Stace, and I edit fantasy novels. I'm here with my list of do's and don'ts for writers who want to get started on this exciting literary journey. Welcome to Magic and Ink, where we talk about fantasy writing, creative living, and magic. I'm here with some do's and don'ts of writing fantasy. Some you may agree with, some you may not agree with, but this is my list, and I hope you'll take some value from it either way. Let's get started. Do read fantasy books. This may seem obvious, but I think a lot of us developed a love of fantasy from watching The Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones or many of the other fantasy movies and television shows that have made it to the screen in the last few decades. But the problem is watching a movie or a show can't teach you how to write a book. We really need to read the genre if we want to create compelling stories in it. We really need to be reading in the genre, both classic books as well as newly published books, to have a full understanding of what works and what doesn't work and what's already been done to death. There's no way we can read everything, but a good cross-section from across the decades and from what's been newly published will help us figure out what sort of fantasy we're telling. And when the time comes, it will help us market it even better. Don't read only fantasy books. If we only read fantasy, it's going to limit what we have to say. For all its specialization, fantasy is just one way of exploring the human condition. We can learn from other genres. Romance, mysteries, political thrillers all have ideas that we can borrow, dress up in fantasy finery, and tell something that's completely unique and new. We can also learn from nonfiction. Nonfiction expands our understanding of the world, teaches about the problems of the real world, and exposes us to new ways of thinking about things. Mythology, history, and anthropology are natural resources for world-building ideas when you're developing your fantasy setting. Psychology teaches us about how people think and feel. Geology tells us about how the world works in a physical way. Philosophy exposes us to ideas and concepts that add depth and meaning to everything that we write. Economics, sociology, and all kinds of science broaden our minds and can add depth to the fiction that we write. Do start with characters or plot, not setting. I know. How can we create a character or a plot if we don't know the world that it exists in? The problem with that kind of thinking is that settings aren't stories. Readers aren't going to care about your setting until you give them a character to care about or are invested in finding out what's going to happen. To paraphrase Lisa Cron in the book Story Genius, stories are the tool that we use to pass on information that helps us function in our societies. A fantasy setting, all by itself, isn't going to pass on any useful information. It's the people, what they do, the choices that they make, and how they react to the situations that they are in that will pass on the information that makes the reader care. At the very least, we need the seed of an idea. That can be a core question that we want to explore through the narrative, or it can be just a character concept that is compelling enough that we can't wait to get to know them. Don't spend years world building and never get around to telling your story. I know some of you probably love world building and you can't stop yourself from writing pages and pages and pages about the background of your world. And that's fine if that's what you love, do what you love. However, if we are trying to write a novel, then we need to be careful about falling into a maelstrom of world-building details that really don't enhance the story at all. Do we really need to know a detailed genealogy of the royal family going back 1,000 years? Or do we need to know the name of every body of water within the local region? Or the full text of the religious codex that forms the foundation of the state religion? Probably not. It's enough to have an idea that those things exist without going into too much detail. While it's potentially fascinating, there's no way you can fit all that information into a novel and still have a story that's engaging for the reader. If it's not relevant to the story, we can leave it out. When doing our initial world building, we should focus on what directly influences the plot. If we find we need additional information during the writing process, we can come back and fill it in later. Don't rely on established or overused tropes. A trope is a common or overused theme or device that is used in story after story after story. Some popular ones right now are things like enemies to lovers, fake dating, found family. Tropes also include things like stereotypical settings. For example, medieval European-based cultures, or a Tolkienist breakdown of fantasy species into elves and humans and dwarves and halflings and orcs. Fans can get tired of seeing the same thing over and over again. Plus, too many tropes can make our stories predictable. Tropes can also represent old ways of thinking, worldviews that don't necessarily agree with the way we view the world today. For example, damsel in distress, or the fantasy race equals identity, like all orcs are evil, or the chosen one, or the Dark Lord, or the Return of the King, all reflect a kind of idealism about past societies that maybe don't mesh with the ideals we have today. Do rely on established tropes. We don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we sit down to write a novel. There is nothing new under the sun. Especially when learning to write, building on something familiar is an opportunity to focus on learning our craft. Fans also read the genre with certain expectations and might be disappointed if they don't see them. And it's also true that your book may be the first fantasy book that somebody ever reads. So for them, it's entirely new, even if it's filled with tropes. When it comes down to it, if it's fun for you to write, it's probably going to be fun for somebody else to read. Don't infodump. An infodump is a passage of unnecessary exposition that provides a lot of information about setting or backstory in an unwieldy chunk. It interrupts the flow of the story and can induce boredom in the reader. The worst kind of infodumps are prologues that describe how the world was created or how the Dark Lord came to power, or otherwise establish the setting and backstory for your novel. The problem with that kind of prologue is that we don't know enough to care about reading all that information. It's a little bit like going back to school. The rule of thumb is to hook the reader first with an interesting character and plot, and then fill in the backstory that they need to know later. Try to avoid putting in long blocks of backstory or description or lore. We have to learn how to weave that information through the story, through action and dialogue. When the details get intrusive, we have to stop and ask ourselves, does the reader need to know this in order to understand what is happening? If the answer is no, then we can probably leave it out. Do describe the food. Food and other essentials of daily life can have multiple functions within a narrative. Crafts, clothing, animal husbandry, all of these can do double duty, making our worlds feel like people really live there. And they're not just empty stages for the plot and dialogue to be carried out. Along with world building, food can be used to convey character emotions and traits. And the activities of preparing and eating food are natural backdrops for scenes. Eating is something we all do, usually several times a day. Just be careful not to fall into research rabbit holes and then dump all the information you learn onto the page of your story. We always need to think strategically about how we reveal this information so that it enhances our story and not distracts from it. Don't overwrite. Language and description is tricky in fantasy. Classic works used an elevated style that harkened back to medieval epics of yore, or more modern tributes to those works, like the works of Lord Dunsany. We may want to use that kind of language to create a sense of grandeur or mystery, especially when writing epic fantasy or high fantasy or mythic fantasy. But it can be off-putting to readers who just want an easy reading experience. And if it's done badly, it's just bad. That doesn't mean we can't write with style, but we have to practice how to blend our more archaic or poetic phrasing with prose that feels more like natural speech. A good trick is to read our work aloud. If we find it hard to say, then the reader is probably going to stumble over it too. Do be fantastic. The joy of fantasy is in the fantastic, the sense of wonder from exploring worlds that are filled with magic. Even in stories with no active magic, we can weave in threads of the mythic that elevate it above common, everyday fiction. But if we're not going to have magic, why write fantasy? Don't put magic above human ability. Even in the most magical worlds, the characters should still be at the heart of the story. Characters' actions, decisions, and growth should be what matters in the climax. Not superpowers, not magical weapons, and not otherworldly beings. Those things might help the hero succeed in the end, but it should be the hero that is the deciding factor, not the magic that they wield. That's it for my do's and don'ts for writing fantasy. Do you agree? Do you disagree? I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. Also, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel. I have more content planned for fantasy writers coming up in the near future, and I hope you'll stick around to find out. Thanks very much, and I'll see you next time on Magic and Ink.